Luxeuil-les-Bains, France, May 18, 1916, 0530 hours, and Lieutenant Norman Prince, a Harvard-educated socialite from Boston who could have spent the war in comfortable safety, sits in the cramped cockpit of a Nieuport 11 Bebe fighter, feeling the cold morning air bite through his leather flying coat as his mechanic spins the propeller to start the rotary engine. The engine coughs, catches, then roars to life, the entire aircraft vibrating as the 9-cylinder Larone rotary spins at 1,200 revolutions per minute, its distinctive castor oil exhaust creating a cloud of blue-white smoke that drifts across the grass airfield. Prince is about to lead 6 other Americans on their first official patrol as Escadrille Américaine, the world's first squadron composed entirely of American volunteer pilots fighting for a foreign nation. What makes this moment extraordinary is not just that these 7 men have volunteered to fight in a war their own country has refused to join, but that they're about to climb into flimsy wood and fabric machines barely more advanced than the Wright brothers' original design, to engage in aerial combat that has already killed hundreds of pilots in the 20 months since the war began. And within hours, these American volunteers will discover that the romantic notion of aerial combat bears no resemblance whatsoever to the brutal reality of machine gun fire tearing through canvas wings, of watching friends spin to earth in flames, of the terror that comes from fighting 3 miles above the ground in machines that can disintegrate without warning. The story of America's first military airmen begins not with official military policy or congressional appropriations, but with individual Americans who saw war consuming Europe and decided they could not remain neutral regardless of what their government chose. Norman Prince, born into Boston's wealthiest families, educated at Harvard and trained as a lawyer, had learned to fly in 1911 at the Burgess Company Flying School in Marblehead, Massachusetts, earning his pilot's license from the Aero Club of America, when aviation was still considered a dangerous sport practiced by wealthy daredevils and mechanical enthusiasts. When war erupted in August 1914, Prince watched from America as France, the country he had visited numerous times and grown to love, faced German invasion. By December 1914, Prince was in Paris, meeting with officials from the French War Ministry, proposing the creation of an American volunteer squadron that could fight for France while America remained neutral. The idea faced significant obstacles, including diplomatic complications of Americans fighting for a belligerent nation, military concerns about integrating foreign volunteers into French units, and practical questions about whether Americans had the skill and courage to fight in the increasingly deadly air war developing over the Western Front. Prince found allies in his vision, particularly William Thaw, another wealthy American who had learned to fly before the war, and who arrived in France in 1914 driving an ambulance for the American Field Service. Thaw, from a prominent Pittsburgh family, had witnessed the carnage of the Western Front firsthand, had seen French soldiers dying by the thousands in futile attacks against German positions, and had decided that driving ambulances, while useful, was not enough contribution when he possessed skills that could be used in combat. Thaw had already transferred to the French Air Service by the time Prince arrived with his proposal, flying observation missions and learning the brutal realities of aerial combat. The third crucial figure was Dr. Edmund Gros, an American physician living in Paris who had founded the American Ambulance Corps and who had connections throughout French military and governmental circles. Gros understood both the practical value of experienced American pilots and the propaganda benefits of showing American volunteers fighting alongside Frenchmen, demonstrating that not all Americans supported their government's neutrality. Through months of negotiations, meetings with French officials, and persistent advocacy, Prince, Thaw and Gros finally achieved approval in March 1916 for the creation of an American volunteer squadron. The French War Ministry agreed to furnish aircraft, mechanics and equipment to provide French officers to command the unit, and to integrate the American squadron into the French Air Service with the same status and missions as any French squadron. The Americans would wear French uniforms, fly French aircraft, and fight under French military law. In return, they would bring skills desperately needed as the air war intensified, would boost morale by demonstrating international support for France, and would potentially influence American public opinion toward intervention in the war. The squadron was initially designated Escadrille Américaine, later changed to Escadrille Lafayette after German diplomatic protests about the use of the word American, invoking the name of the French nobleman who had aided American independence as symbolic repayment of that historic debt. The 7 original American pilots who reported to the squadron's first base at Luxeuil-les-Bains in April 1916 represented a cross-section of American society unusual for military units of that era. Norman Prince brought his wealth, education, and vision for the squadron. William Thor contributed combat experience and connections to French military leadership. Kiffin Rockwell from Asheville, North Carolina, a former student at Washington and Lee University and Virginia Military Institute, had been fighting in the French Foreign Legion since 1914, surviving brutal trench warfare before transferring to aviation. His brother Paul would later join the squadron as well, creating one of several family connections in the unit. Victor Chapman, a Harvard architecture student and son of a prominent author, possessed the idealism common among educated young Americans who saw the war as a crusade for civilization against barbarism. Elliot Cowden, a New York socialite, brought enthusiasm and courage, if not extensive flying experience. Bert Hall, claiming to be from Kentucky though his background remained murky, was a soldier of fortune who had fought in various conflicts before the war, and who had proved to be both a capable pilot and a controversial personality. James McConnell, a University of Virginia graduate who had been driving ambulances, transferred to aviation seeking more direct action against the Germans. These men shared certain characteristics beyond their American nationality. All were volunteers choosing to risk death when they could have remained safely in America or performed less dangerous service. All possessed some flying experience, though the amount varied considerably, with some having only a few hours of flight training before arriving at the squadron. All were relatively young, mostly in their early to mid-20s, an age when concepts of honour, adventure and duty often override rational calculation of risk. And all were white, reflecting the racial attitudes of the era that would largely exclude African Americans from combat aviation until men like Eugene Bullard forced their way into French aviation units through exceptional persistence and skill. The aircraft these Americans would fly, the Nieuport 11 represented French aviation technology in mid-1916, a period when aircraft design was evolving rapidly under the pressure of combat necessity. The Nieuport 11 was a sesquiplane, meaning it had a full-size upper wing and a much smaller lower wing, a design that reduced weight and drag while maintaining structural strength. The aircraft was powered by a 9-cylinder Lerone rotary engine producing 80 horsepower, enough to give the little fighter a top speed of about 97 miles per hour and a ceiling of approximately 15,000 feet. The entire aircraft weighed less than 1,100 pounds empty, was constructed primarily of wood covered with fabric, and could be destroyed by a handful of well-placed machine gun rounds. The pilot sat in an open cockpit exposed to wind, cold, engine fumes, and enemy fire, with minimal instrumentation and no radio communication with the ground or other aircraft. The only weapon was a single Lewis machine gun mounted on the upper wing, firing over the propeller arc, requiring the pilot to aim the entire aircraft at his target, while simultaneously flying, watching for other enemy aircraft and monitoring his position to avoid becoming lost over enemy territory. Flying these machines required skills that went far beyond simply keeping the aircraft in the air. The rotary engine, where the entire engine block rotated around a stationary crankshaft, created significant gyroscopic effects that made the aircraft want to turn in the direction of engine rotation, requiring constant correction by the pilot. The engine could not be throttled in the conventional sense, only switched on or off, or occasionally adjusted with a blip switch that cut ignition momentarily, meaning pilots had to manage speed and altitude through a combination of engine management and aircraft attitude, rather than simple throttle control. The lack of reliable instruments meant pilots navigated by dead reckoning, landmarks, and intuition, with many getting lost and running out of fuel over enemy territory or in bad weather. The lightweight construction meant the aircraft could be overstressed and destroyed by violent maneuvers, with wings sometimes tearing off during steep dives or sharp turns. And the complete lack of safety equipment meant that any serious damage to the aircraft, any engine failure over enemy territory, any wound that incapacitated the pilot, would almost certainly result in death. The tactical situation these American volunteers entered in May 1916 was dominated by German air superiority achieved through the Fokker-Eindecker monoplane equipped with synchronized machine guns that could fire through the propeller arc. This innovation, developed by Anthony Fokker's design team in 1915, had created what Allied pilots called the Fokker Scourge, a period where German fighters slaughtered Allied reconnaissance and bombing aircraft almost at will. The Nieuport 11, introduced in early 1916, was France's answer to the Fokker, faster and more maneuverable than the German monoplane, with superior climbing ability that allowed Nieuport pilots to gain altitude advantage before engaging. But the small American squadron would be facing German pilots with months or years of combat experience, men who had developed tactics, honed their marksmanship, and learned to work together as units. The Americans would have to learn these lessons quickly or die in the attempt. The squadron's commander, Captain Georges Thénault, a regular French Air Service officer with extensive combat experience, faced the challenge of transforming enthusiastic American volunteers into effective combat pilots without getting them all killed in the process. Thénault understood that the Americans' limited flying experience and complete lack of combat experience made them extraordinarily vulnerable, that German pilots would target inexperienced enemy fighters mercilessly, that mistakes that might be survivable on the ground would be instantly fatal in the air. He instituted a training regime that emphasized formation flying, navigation, gunnery practice, and the specific tactics needed for aerial combat. The Americans practiced for hours, learning to maintain formation while maneuvering, to coordinate attacks, to watch each other's tails for approaching enemies, to recognize German aircraft types and their capabilities. They flew practice missions over French territory, learning the landmarks they would use for navigation, identifying the locations of friendly and enemy airfields, understanding the geography of the front lines that snaked through eastern France from the English Channel to Switzerland. The psychological preparation proved as important as the technical training, because aerial combat in 1916 was unlike any previous form of warfare. Pilots fought individually or in small groups, with no support available once they crossed the front lines, no possibility of retreat if badly wounded, no chance of being rescued if shot down over enemy territory. The terror of combat came not just from the danger of being shot, but from the horrible ways pilots could die. Aircraft caught fire easily, with gasoline tanks positioned directly in front of the cockpit and no fire suppression systems, turning fighters into flying torches in seconds. Pilots carried no parachutes, considered impractical given the low altitude of most combat and the bulk of early parachute designs, meaning anyone whose aircraft caught fire faced the choice between burning to death or jumping to a quicker end. Structural failures during combat maneuvers caused aircraft to break apart in flight, leaving pilots to fall thousands of feet to their deaths. And wounds that would be survivable on the ground became fatal in the air when the wounded pilot lost control of his aircraft or was unable to navigate back to friendly territory. The squadron's first combat missions in May 1916 brought the Americans face to face with these realities. On May 18th, Norman Prince led a patrol of 6 aircraft, climbing to 10,000 feet before crossing the front lines near Mulhouse. The patrol encountered German aircraft almost immediately, a formation of 4 Fokker Eindeckers that had been providing escort for German reconnaissance aircraft. The German formation leader, seeing the distinctive circular markings on the Nieuport's fuselages that identified them as French aircraft, maneuvered his formation for an attack, likely unaware that he was engaging American pilots on their first combat mission. The ensuing fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, a swirling melee of aircraft turning, diving and climbing, while pilots tried to line up shots with their single machine guns. Kiffin Rockwell, the former Foreign Legion soldier, managed to damage one German aircraft, seeing his tracer round strike its wing fabric before the German pilot dove away trailing smoke. But the Americans' inexperience showed in their inability to maintain formation, their tendency to fixate on single targets while losing awareness of other threats, their difficulty with gunnery while maneuvering at high speed. The patrol returned to base with all aircraft intact, but with a sobering understanding that combat flying required skills they had not yet fully developed. The squadron's first victory came on May the 24th when Kiffin Rockwell, flying alone on a voluntary patrol, encountered a German 2-seater reconnaissance aircraft over Thann. Rockwell dove on the German from above and behind, the classic attacking position that gave him speed advantage and placed him in the German observer's blind spot. Opening fire at close range, perhaps 50 yards, Rockwell walked his tracer rounds into the German aircraft's fuselage, seeing pieces of fabric tear away, watching the German pilot slump forward over his controls. The German aircraft nosed over into a steep dive, falling toward the ground far below while Rockwell circled, watching his victory confirmed. The wreckage crashed into French territory, allowing recovery and verification of the kill, making it the first confirmed victory for an American pilot fighting in the war. Rockwell returned to base to celebrations from his squadron mates, toasts with champagne that French sympathizers had donated to the American volunteers, congratulations from French officers who saw the victory as validation of their decision to create the American squadron. But the celebration was tempered by the growing awareness that aerial combat was a deadly business with a grim arithmetic. For every victory there were defeats, wounds, deaths. Victor Chapman, the idealistic Harvard architecture student, became the squadron's first fatality on June 23, 1916, when he was shot down during a patrol over Verdun. Chapman had been hit by ground fire during a low-level attack, his aircraft damaged but still flying. Instead of returning to base, he continued the patrol, refusing to abandon his squadron mates. When the patrol encountered German fighters, Chapman's damaged aircraft could not maneuver effectively, and a German pilot poured machine gun fire into the crippled Nieuport. Chapman's aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, pieces of wing and fuselage separating as the aircraft fell. His body was found in the wreckage in no man's land, recovered weeks later when French infantry advanced, buried with military honours in a cemetery near the battlefield. Chapman's death shocked the squadron, forcing the Americans to confront the reality that their enthusiasm and courage could not protect them from the random violence of aerial combat, that skill and luck both played roles in survival, that good men could die through no fault of their own. The squadron continued fighting through the summer and fall of 1916, accumulating victories, suffering losses, learning the brutal lessons of aerial combat. The Americans developed reputations as aggressive pilots willing to take risks, perhaps too willing, diving into fights against superior numbers, pressing attacks to dangerously close range, sometimes forgetting that survival required balancing aggression with caution. Norman Prince, the squadron's founder, was seriously injured on October 12, 1916, when his aircraft struck a high-tension power line during a night landing, the impact breaking his leg and causing internal injuries. He died 3 days later from complications, another American volunteer who had given his life for France before his own country entered the war. Kiffin Rockwell, the squadron's first ace with 5 confirmed victories, died on September 23, 1916, killed during a patrol over Verdun when a German aircraft fired a single burst that struck Rockwell in the chest, the bullet killing him instantly. His Nieuport crashed behind German lines, and his body was recovered and buried by German soldiers who treated his remains with the respect one warrior shows another. The squadron's roster changed constantly as new American volunteers arrived to replace casualties, and as some original members transferred to other French squadrons or returned to America. Raoul Lufbery, a French-born American who had been barnstorming in Asia before the war, joined the squadron in May 1916 and quickly became its most successful pilot, developing tactics and skills that would make him America's first true ace of aces. Lufbery understood that survival in aerial combat required discipline, careful observation, and willingness to break off engagements when the odds turned unfavourable. He taught the newer pilots to always check their surroundings before attacking, to maintain altitude advantage, to approach targets from out of the sun where they were difficult to see, to never fixate on a single target at the expense of situational awareness. Lufbery's methods proved effective, and he accumulated 17 confirmed victories by the time America entered the war in April 1917, making him the most experienced American combat pilot when the United States finally began forming its own air service. The diplomatic situation changed dramatically in April 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany, transforming the American volunteers from fighters for a foreign cause into representatives of their own nation's military effort. The Lafayette Escadrille, as it was now known, became a symbol of American courage and commitment, celebrated in American newspapers, featured in recruiting posters, used as proof that Americans could fight as effectively as any European soldiers. New American volunteers flooded into France, eager to join the famous squadron, though most were directed to other French squadrons that needed experienced English-speaking pilots to help train the flood of new American pilots arriving with minimal experience. The Lafayette Flying Corps, the broader organization of Americans flying for France, eventually included over 200 pilots distributed among various French squadrons, all contributing to the Allied air effort while wearing French uniforms and flying French aircraft. The formation of the United States Air Service in 1918 brought new challenges and opportunities as America attempted to create from nothing an air force capable of supporting a million-man army in France. The Americans who had been flying for France faced decisions about whether to transfer to American squadrons, where they would likely receive promotions and positions of authority based on their combat experience, or remain with their French units where they had developed bonds of friendship and unit pride. Many chose to transfer, becoming instructors, squadron commanders, and staff officers who could pass their hard-won knowledge to the masses of newly trained American pilots arriving from flight schools in the United States. Others remained with French units, preferring to stay with the squadrons they knew rather than join untested American formations. The United States Air Service in 1918 faced enormous obstacles in creating an effective combat force. America had entered the war with only about 100 trained military pilots, most with minimal flight time and no combat experience. The aircraft industry in the United States was tiny, producing primarily trainers and unable to manufacture combat aircraft in meaningful numbers. The logistics of transporting, housing, training, and equipping thousands of pilots and ground crew overwhelmed existing systems. American pilots trained on French and British aircraft because American manufacturers could not produce combat types quickly enough. American squadrons flew French Nieuports and Espads and British SE-5s and Sopwith Camels because American designs were not ready for combat. Even basic items like flying suits, goggles and leather helmets had to be purchased from European suppliers or improvised from whatever was available. The first American squadrons to reach the front, the 94th and 95th Pursuit Squadrons, arrived in March 1918 with pilots who had completed training but who lacked the combat experience of the Lafayette veterans. These squadrons were equipped with Nieuport 28 fighters, a French aircraft that had been rejected by French air units because of structural problems that caused upper wing fabric to tear off during steep dives. The American squadrons had to learn through bitter experience about their aircraft's limitations, with several pilots killed when their upper wings failed during combat. Lieutenant Douglas Campbell of the 94th Squadron became the first American pilot fighting in an American squadron to achieve a confirmed victory on April 14, 1918, shooting down a German Albatross over the lines near Toul. Campbell's victory, coming just weeks after his squadron had arrived at the front, demonstrated that properly trained American pilots could compete effectively with veteran German fighters when given adequate aircraft and leadership. Eddie Rickenbacker, a former race car driver and chauffeur to General Pershing, emerged as America's most successful fighter pilot, eventually credited with 26 confirmed victories, making him the top American ace of the war. Rickenbacker joined the 94th Squadron in March 1918 as an experienced pilot but complete novice in combat flying. He learned quickly, developing tactics similar to Lufbery's that emphasize careful stalking of targets, exploitation of altitude and sun position advantages, and disciplined fire control that made every bullet count. Rickenbacker understood that aerial combat was not a gentleman's sport but a deadly business where the goal was to kill the enemy while minimizing risk to oneself and one's squadron mates. He studied German tactics, learned to recognize individual German pilots by their aircraft markings and flying styles, and developed an almost uncanny ability to sense danger and position himself advantageously. His success came not from superior aircraft or equipment, which the Germans often possessed, but from superior tactics, situational awareness, and marksmanship. Frank Luke, an Arizona-born pilot with the 27th Aero Squadron, demonstrated a different approach to aerial combat, specializing in attacks on German observation balloons. These hydrogen-filled balloons, positioned a few miles behind the lines at altitudes of several thousand feet, provided German artillery observers with commanding views of Allied territory, allowing accurate targeting of artillery fire. The balloons were heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols, making balloon attacks extraordinarily dangerous. Luke, aggressive to the point of recklessness, made balloon attacks his specialty, diving through anti-aircraft fire to get close enough to set the balloons aflame with incendiary ammunition. Between September 12th and 29th, 1918, Luke destroyed 14 balloons and 4 aircraft, an incredible achievement in just 18 days of combat. On September 29th, Luke shot down 3 balloons in 10 minutes before being hit by ground fire, his aircraft crashing behind German lines. Wounded and surrounded by German infantry, Luke died fighting, becoming one of the war's most celebrated American heroes. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only 2 American airmen to receive the nation's highest decoration during World War I. The scale of American air operations in 1918 grew enormously as more squadrons arrived at the front and as American industry finally began producing aircraft and equipment in useful quantities. By the armistice in November 1918, the air service had grown to 45 squadrons at the front with over 700 aircraft and nearly 8,000 officers and men. American pilots flew thousands of combat missions, accumulated hundreds of confirmed victories, supported ground operations during major offenses, and demonstrated that American aviation could match European standards when given adequate training and equipment. But the cost had been severe. Over 300 American airmen died in combat, many more were seriously wounded, and aircraft losses ran into the hundreds as replacements struggled to keep pace with combat attrition. The psychological toll on the pilots themselves could not be measured in statistics. Men watched their friends die, saw aircraft explode in midair, experienced the terror of being shot at while helpless thousands of feet above the ground. Many developed what would later be recognized as combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress, manifesting as nightmares, inability to sleep, compulsive checking of aircraft before flights, superstitious rituals performed before every mission. Some lost their nerve entirely, unable to force themselves into the cockpit, invalided out of combat flying with diagnoses like neurasthenia or shell shock. Others became fatalistic, continuing to fly and fight while convinced they would not survive, taking increasingly reckless chances as if seeking death. The few who survived multiple tours of duty, men like Rickenbacker and Lufbery, carried scars less visible than wounds, but no less real. The Americans who flew in World War I established traditions and standards that would define American military aviation for generations. They proved that American pilots could compete with the best in the world, that American courage and adaptability could overcome initial disadvantages in equipment and experience, that individual initiative and tactical innovation mattered as much as following established doctrine. The Lafayette Escadrille veterans, the men who had flown for France before America entered the war, held special status as pioneers who had proven American capability when it was still questioned. Their squadron insignia, a Seminole head in war bonnet designed by a French artist, became one of the most recognized symbols of American aviation, later adopted by various Air Force units seeking connection to that pioneering heritage. The technical lessons learned by the American airmen in World War I influenced aircraft design and tactical doctrine for decades. The importance of altitude advantage recognized by pilots like Lufbery and Rickenbacker became fundamental to fighter tactics through World War II and beyond. The value of coordinated formation attacks, learned painfully through losses when pilots fought individually, established the basic tactical unit of the flight or section that still defines fighter operations. The necessity of reliable communications, understood when pilots watched helpless as squadron mates were shot down because they couldn't be warned of approaching enemies, drove development of radio equipment that would eventually transform aerial combat. The recognition that pilots needed extensive training before entering combat, learned when inadequately trained pilots died within weeks of reaching the front, established training standards that the Army Air Corps and later the Air Force would maintain and expand. The individual stories of American pilots from World War I reveal both the universal experience of combat and the uniquely American characteristics that defined their service. These were men from all regions of the country, from wealthy families and working-class backgrounds, from elite universities and rural communities, united by willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous form of combat yet devised. They brought with them American attitudes about individualism, about the importance of initiative, about the value of practical innovation over rigid adherence to doctrine. When equipment didn't work as designed, they modified it. When tactics proved ineffective, they developed new ones. When authority seemed wrong, they questioned it. These American characteristics, sometimes frustrating to European allies accustomed to more hierarchical military structures, proved remarkably effective in the fluid, fast-paced environment of aerial combat where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The transition from individual pilot training to formation tactics represented one of the most important developments in American aviation during 1918. The early American squadrons, influenced by Lafayette veterans who had learned to fly individually or in pairs, initially operated with minimal coordination. Pilots took off together, flew toward enemy territory together, but once combat began, each pilot fought his own battle with a limited awareness of what his squadron mates were doing. This approach, while allowing individual skill to shine, left pilots vulnerable to coordinated German attacks and made it difficult to protect damaged aircraft or less experienced pilots. Through painful experience, American squadrons learned to fight as units, maintaining formation during combat when possible, assigning specific roles like high cover and attack element to different pilots, developing hand signals and maneuvering cues that allowed coordination without radio communication. The ground crews supporting American air operations deserve recognition equal to the pilots they served, because without skilled mechanics, armourers, and support personnel, not a single mission could have been flown. These men worked brutal hours in primitive conditions, maintaining temperamental rotary engines that required constant adjustment, repairing fabric-covered wings and fuselages damaged by combat and rough landings, cleaning and loading machine guns that jammed, if not perfectly maintained, fueling aircraft powered from hand-pumped gasoline drums. They worked through cold nights to have aircraft ready for dawn patrols, improvised solutions to mechanical problems when spare parts were unavailable, and watched pilots they had come to know as friends climb into cockpits, knowing some would not return. The pride these ground crews took in their work, their determination to keep every possible aircraft flying despite impossible conditions, contributed directly to the combat effectiveness of American squadrons. The medical care available to wounded pilots improved significantly over the course of American involvement in the war, though it remained primitive by later standards. Pilots who crash-landed in friendly territory with serious injuries often survived, thanks to the network of casualty clearing stations and hospitals that had been established to support ground operations. But wounds received in the air over enemy territory or in aircraft that crashed behind German lines were almost always fatal. Some pilots carried pistols not just for self-defense if shot down, but to ensure a quick death if badly wounded and facing capture or prolonged suffering. The psychological impact of knowing that certain types of wounds were death sentences because of the impossibility of receiving medical care while flying over enemy territory added another layer of stress to an already terrifying form of combat. The armistice of November 11, 1918, brought an end to combat operations but not an end to flying for American airmen. Squadrons continued to patrol and train, prepared to resume combat if the armistice collapsed and fighting resumed. Many pilots remained in France for months after the armistice, waiting for demobilization, flying demonstration flights for visiting dignitaries, participating in victory celebrations. The transition from combat flying to peacetime aviation proved difficult for some pilots who had spent months or years in an environment where every flight could mean death, where hypervigilance and split-second reactions determined survival, where the adrenaline of combat provided a powerful drug that civilian life could not replace. Some pilots continued flying after the war, becoming barnstormers, airmail pilots, or aviation instructors. Others abandoned flying entirely, unable to find the same sense of purpose in peacetime aviation that combat had provided. A few, like Eddie Rickenbacker, parlayed their wartime fame into successful civilian careers, though Rickenbacker himself struggled in the immediate post-war years before finding success in the automobile industry and later in commercial aviation. The Lafayette Escadrille pilots, those who survived, held special reunions for decades after the war, gathering to remember fallen comrades and celebrate the unique experience they had shared as American volunteers fighting for France before their own nation entered the conflict. These veterans understood that they had participated in something unprecedented, the first time American military aviators had fought in organized combat, the first time American and European pilots had served together in integrated units, the first proof that American aviation could compete at the highest levels of aerial warfare. The memorial built near Paris to honor the Lafayette pilots, both those who survived and those who gave their lives, stood as physical reminder that some Americans had been willing to fight for principles they believed important regardless of their government's official neutrality. The influence of World War I aviation experience extended far beyond the immediate post-war period, shaping the development of American military aviation through the interwar years and into World War II. Many of the senior officers who commanded American air forces in World War II had learned to fly during World War I, had absorbed the lessons about the importance of air superiority, close air support, and strategic bombing that would define air doctrine for decades. The organizational structure of the Army Air Forces in World War II traced directly to the air service of World War I, with similar squadron and group structures, similar distinctions between pursuit, bombardment, and observation aviation, similar emphasis on aggressive offensive operations. The tactical formations used by American fighters in World War II, the Finger Four formation that replaced outdated Vic formations, represented evolution of principles first learned in World War I about the need for mutual support and flexible response to enemy actions. The cultural impact of World War I aviation on American society proved equally significant, creating a fascination with military aviation that persisted through generations. The image of the fighter pilot as an independent warrior, skilled craftsman and romantic hero became embedded in American culture, appearing in literature, film, and popular imagination. Books like Fighting the Flying Circus by Eddie Rickenbacker and Falcons of France by Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall, former Lafayette Flying Corps pilots, brought the experience of World War I aviation to mass audiences, creating mythologies that influenced how Americans understood military service and heroism. The Hollywood films of the 1920s and 1930s, from Wings to Hell's Angels to The Dawn Patrol, depicted World War I aviators as noble warriors fighting a cleaner, more honourable form of warfare than the mud and blood of the trenches, a portrayal that bore limited relationship to the actual experience, but that powerfully shaped public perceptions. The technical achievements of American aviation during World War I should not be overstated, as the United States never developed a combat aircraft that exceeded European designs and remained dependent on Allied equipment throughout the war. But American pilots and ground crews demonstrated remarkable ability to master complex foreign equipment, to adapt European tactics to American circumstances, to innovate solutions to novel problems. This practical, empirical approach to aviation, less concerned with theoretical perfection than with what worked in combat, became a defining characteristic of American military aviation. Where European air forces sometimes became trapped by doctrine and established procedures, American aviation maintained flexibility and willingness to experiment, characteristics that would prove valuable in future conflicts. The human cost of creating American military aviation cannot be forgotten when celebrating achievements and victories. Beyond the 300 who died in combat, hundreds more died in training accidents as the rushed expansion of pilot training outpaced safety procedures and adequate instructor availability. The young men who volunteered for aviation service, attracted by the glamour and excitement of flying, often had little understanding of the mortality rates they faced. In some squadrons, life expectancy for new pilots could be measured in weeks. The psychological burden carried by survivors, the guilt of having lived when so many friends and comrades died, affected many veterans for the remainder of their lives. Some sought solace in alcohol, others in constant activity that prevented reflection on wartime experiences, others in complete withdrawal from social connection. The evolution of aerial combat from individual duels to coordinated formation attacks represented not just tactical adaptation but fundamental change in the nature of aerial warfare. The early war period, when pilots like Norman Prince and Kiffin Rockwell fought primarily in individual or pairs, emphasized personal skill and courage. Each pilot was largely responsible for his own success or failure, and victories came from individual superiority in flying skill, marksmanship, and tactical judgment. By 1918, aerial combat had become a team sport where individual skill still mattered, but where coordination, communication, and mutual support determined outcomes more than any pilot's solo capabilities. American squadrons learned these lessons, sometimes slowly and at great cost, but they learned them, transforming from collections of brave individuals into effective military units. The role of African American aviators in World War I aviation deserves mention, though it was unfortunately limited by the racism of the era. Eugene Bullard, born in Georgia but living in France, became the first African American military pilot when he joined the French Air Service in 1917, flying combat missions and earning the Croix de Guerre. When America entered the war, Bullard attempted to transfer to American aviation, but was refused because the Army Air Service did not accept African Americans as pilots. Bullard remained in French service, completing his tour of duty and surviving the war, but his exclusion from American aviation demonstrated the racial barriers that would not begin to break down until the Tuskegee Airmen proved African American capability in World War II. The lost potential, the skilled men who were denied opportunity to serve based solely on race, represented a shameful aspect of early American military aviation. The legacy of America's first airmen extends beyond specific tactical innovations or individual acts of heroism to encompass the fundamental establishment of American military aviation as an effective fighting force. These pilots and ground crews proved that Americans could excel at this new form of warfare, could develop the skills and discipline required for success, could create effective units from volunteers with diverse backgrounds. They established traditions of courage, innovation, and determination that would define American military aviation through subsequent conflicts and into the modern era. The specific challenges faced by American aviation in creating a combat force from essentially nothing in 18 months highlighted both weaknesses and strengths of American military organization. The weakness showed in the lack of preparation, the absence of adequate aircraft production, the shortage of trained instructors and support personnel. When war was declared in April 1917, the United States possessed fewer military aircraft than most European nations had lost in single months of combat. The aviation infrastructure required for training, maintenance, and operations had to be built from scratch while simultaneously conducting combat operations. But American strength showed in the speed of mobilization, the willingness to adopt foreign equipment and tactics rather than insisting on American determines, the ability to rapidly train large numbers of pilots and ground crews to acceptable standards. By November 1918, American aviation had grown from almost nothing to a force of thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of personnel, an organizational achievement that demonstrated the American talent for large-scale industrial and military mobilization. The international cooperation between American and Allied aviation forces during World War I created relationships and shared experiences that influenced military aviation for decades. American pilots trained by French and British instructors learned not just flying techniques but cultural approaches to aerial combat, absorbing French emphasis on individual initiate and British focus on formation discipline. These cross-cultural exchanges enriched American aviation doctrine, allowing the incorporation of best practices from multiple national traditions rather than rigid adherence to any single approach. The personal friendships formed between American pilots and their European comrades, bonds forged in the shared danger of combat, created informal networks that facilitated cooperation in subsequent conflicts. Many American aviation officers who served in World War I maintained correspondence with European counterparts throughout the interwar period, exchanging information about aircraft development, tactical innovations, and organizational structures that helped American aviation remain current with European advances despite tight peacetime budgets. The evolution of aircraft technology during the period of American involvement in World War I demonstrated the rapid pace of aeronautical development driven by combat necessity. The Newport 11 fighters that equipped early American squadrons in 1916 and 1917 were obsolete by 1918, replaced by the more powerful SPAD-13 with its 220 horsepower engine and twin machine guns. Aircraft that seemed cutting-edge in 1917 were death traps by late 1918, when facing improved German fighters. This constant technological evolution required pilots to continuously adapt, learning new aircraft types, adjusting tactics to exploit new capabilities, understanding how changes in relative performance affected combat outcomes. American pilots proved remarkably adaptable, transitioning between aircraft types more rapidly than European doctrines typically allowed, demonstrating the American tendency to treat equipment as tools to be mastered quickly rather than systems requiring lengthy familiarization. The broader strategic impact of American aviation in World War I, while modest compared to the massive ground forces America deployed, proved significant in specific contexts. American pursuit squadrons helped maintain air superiority over American sector of the Western Front, allowing reconnaissance and observation aircraft to operate with relative freedom while denying German aircraft similar access. American bombardment squadrons, though equipped with inadequate aircraft and suffering high casualties, demonstrated American willingness to engage in strategic bombing concepts that would dominate air warfare thinking in subsequent decades. American observation squadrons, perhaps the least celebrated but most consistently valuable aviation units, provided artillery spotting and battlefield reconnaissance that directly supported ground operations, proving that aviation's contribution to warfare extended far beyond the dramatic fighter combats that captured public imagination. The leadership development in American aviation during World War I created a generation of officers who would guide American military aviation through the interwar period and into World War II. Billy Mitchell, who commanded American aviation forces in France, developed the strategic bombing theories that would influence American air doctrine for decades, even though his aggressive advocacy and insubordination eventually led to his court-martial. Carl Spaatz, who flew combat missions in 1918, would command American strategic bombing forces in Europe during World War II. Ira Eaker, another World War I veteran, would lead the 8th Air Force in its daylight bombing campaign against Germany. The experiences these men gained in World War I, the lessons they learned about the capabilities and limitations of air power, shaped their thinking about how aviation should be employed, organized, and developed. Their first-hand knowledge of combat flying gave them credibility when arguing for increased aviation budgets and independence from ground force control during the interwar years. The public relations impact of successful American aviation in World War I proved as important as the military achievements in establishing aviation as a permanent component of American military power. The aces, the men like Rickenbacker, Luke, and the Lafayette veterans, became national heroes, celebrated in newspapers, featured in parades, used in recruiting campaigns. Their fame helped justify the enormous expenditures on aviation during the war, and supported arguments for maintaining strong aviation forces during peacetime. The public fascination with aviation, sparked by these wartime heroes, created political support for aviation development that might otherwise have been difficult to maintain during the budget-conscious 1920s and 1930s. Politicians who might have viewed aviation as experimental or unnecessary could point to the demonstrated effectiveness of American pilots in combat as justification for continued investment. The public relations impact of successful American aviation in World War I proved as important as the military achievements in establishing aviation as a permanent component of American military power. The aces, the men like Rickenbacker, Luke, and the Lafayette veterans, became national heroes, celebrated in newspapers, featured in parades, used in recruiting campaigns. Their fame helped justify the enormous expenditures on aviation during the YIP, and supported arguments for maintaining strong aviation forces during peacetime. The public fascination with aviation, sparked by these wartime heroes, created political support for aviation development that might otherwise have been difficult to maintain during the budget-conscious 1920s and 1930s. Politicians who might have viewed aviation as experimental or unnecessary could point to the demonstrated effectiveness of American pilots in combat as justification for continued investment. The treatment of German prisoners captured by American aviators and the occasional interactions between American and German pilots who encountered each other outside combat revealed interesting aspects of aerial warfare's culture during World War I. Despite the mortal combat in the air, there existed among pilots a sense of mutual respect based on shared understanding of the dangers they faced. German pilots who were shot down and captured by American forces often received respectful treatment, with American pilots curious about German aircraft and tactics, willing to discuss aerial combat as professionals discussing their craft. This wasn't universal. Hatred and desire for revenge certainly existed, especially among pilots who had lost close friends to German fire, but the broader pattern suggested that pilots on both sides recognized they were engaged in a new form of warfare that set them apart from ground combatants, creating a separate culture with its own codes and standards. Stories circulated of German pilots dropping notes over Allied airfields, announcing the death of respected opponents, of Allied pilots doing the same for downed Germans, of pilots on both sides refusing to shoot at enemies in parachutes or crippled aircraft attempting to land. Whether these chivalrous gestures were as common as later mythology suggested is debatable, but their persistence in aviation culture revealed something important about how pilots understood their role and their relationship with enemy pilots. The logistical challenges of supporting American aviation operations in France highlighted weaknesses in American military logistics that would require attention in future conflicts. Aircraft required constant supply of fuel, oil, ammunition, spare parts, and consumables like fabric dope and paint. The specialized nature of aviation logistics, the need for technically trained personnel, the importance of maintaining supply chains for dozens of different aircraft types and engines, overwhelmed existing military supply systems designed for ground forces. American squadrons sometimes faced fuel shortages despite being in France where gasoline was readily available, experienced ammunition shortages that limited training and combat operations, and struggled with spare parts shortages that grounded aircraft for weeks awaiting components that should have been routinely stocked. These problems, while eventually addressed through improved organization and expanded supply infrastructure, demonstrated that aviation required specialized logistics systems distinct from traditional military supply organizations. The personal equipment developed for pilots during World War I, much of it through trial and error as pilots discovered what they needed to survive and fight effectively, became standard items that would be refined but not fundamentally changed for decades. The leather flying coat and helmet, necessary protection against the wind and cold at altitude in open cockpits, became iconic symbols of aviators. The goggles that protected pilots' eyes from wind and engine oil became essential equipment that every pilot required. The silk scarves worn by many pilots, initially adopted for practical reasons of protecting necks from chafing by leather coat collars and for wiping goggles clean of oil, became part of aviation's romantic image. The pistols carried by pilots, originally for self-defense if shot down behind enemy lines, became symbols of the pilot's role as individual warrior even when fighting as part of a larger military organization. These items of personal equipment, developed through practical necessity, became cultural markers that identified military aviators as distinct from other soldiers. The psychological screening of pilot candidates, minimal during World War I but recognized as important, represented early understanding that not everyone possessed the temperament for combat flying. Some men who were brave and capable in ground combat proved unable to handle the unique stresses of aerial combat, the isolation, the three-dimensional nature of the threat, the helplessness when facing mechanical failures or wounds. Others who seemed unlikely warriors quiet men who avoided confrontation on the ground proved remarkably aggressive and effective in the air. The ability to maintain spatial awareness while maneuvering at high speed, to track multiple threats simultaneously, to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, to control fear enough to function effectively while under fire. These capabilities varied widely among individuals in ways that were difficult to predict from ground behavior. The recognition that pilot selection required attention to psychological factors, as well as physical skills and technical knowledge, would influence military aviation training programs for generations. The role of weather in aviation operations, something modern pilots can largely mitigate with instruments and technology, dominated World War I flying in ways that current generations struggle to understand. Pilots flew by visual reference to the ground, meaning that clouds, fog, rain or snow could make navigation impossible and could easily result in pilots becoming lost and running out of fuel. The winds at altitude, often strong and variable, could blow aircraft far off course without pilots realizing it until they saw unfamiliar landmarks or, worse, found themselves over enemy territory. Thunderstorms were deadly, capable of tearing fragile aircraft apart with turbulence or disorienting pilots until they lost control and crashed. Winter weather brought additional dangers as exposed pilots faced genuine risk of frostbite at altitude, as moisture in aircraft systems could freeze, causing control failures, as ice accumulation on wings could make aircraft uncontrollable. American squadrons based in France learned to respect weather as much as enemy action, recognizing that more pilots might die from weather-related accidents than from German guns. The decision about whether to fly in marginal weather conditions became one of the most difficult calls squadron commanders had to make, balancing the need for operations against the risk of losing pilots to preventable weather accidents. The maintenance and repair of combat-damaged aircraft pushed the ingenuity and skill of American ground crews to remarkable levels. Aircraft that returned from combat with fabric torn by bullets, control cables damaged, structural members cracked, engine problems from battle damage or simply from the stress of combat operations, all required immediate attention to return them to flying status. Ground crews often worked through nights, patching fabric, splicing cables, replacing damaged components, doing whatever was necessary to keep aircraft flying. The shortage of replacement aircraft meant that even seriously damaged machines had to be repaired rather than written off, leading to remarkable feats of improvised engineering. Some aircraft were essentially rebuilt multiple times, with so many replacement components that little original structure remained, but as long as they could fly and fight, they were pressed into service. The pride these mechanics took in keeping battered aircraft flying, the personal relationships they developed with their machines, and the pilots who flew them, created a ground crew culture that emphasized skill, dedication, and determination to support the mission, regardless of obstacles. The evolution of aerial gunnery from the early war's almost random spray of bullets to the precise, disciplined fire control of 1918 represented major improvement in combat effectiveness. Early pilots, including many Americans, often expended all their ammunition in a single burst without achieving any hits, victims of inadequate training, poor gun sight design, and failure to understand the complexities of shooting at moving targets while moving at high speed. By 1918, through training and experience, American pilots learned to conserve ammunition, to fire short bursts only when properly positioned, to aim for vulnerable points like engines and fuel tanks rather than simply shooting at the general mass of enemy aircraft. This discipline in fire control separated effective pilots from those who expended ammunition without results, making the difference between pilots who accumulated victories and those who flew mission after mission without success despite encountering enemy aircraft regularly. The night flying operations, attempted by some American units late in the war, primitive by later standards, but pioneering for their time, demonstrated the willingness to push aviation technology beyond its designed limitations. Night flying in open cockpit aircraft with minimal instrumentation, navigating by stars and occasional glimpses of landmarks in moonlight, seeking targets that were almost impossible to find in darkness, represented extraordinary courage and skill. The few successful night missions, where pilots managed to locate and attack German targets despite the near impossible conditions, proved that determined aviators could accomplish remarkable things, even when technology seemed inadequate. These early night operations, though limited in scope and effectiveness, established principles that would be refined and expanded in subsequent conflicts as technology improved. The transition from war to peace for American aviation proved difficult and painful, as the massive build-up was rapidly dismantled. Squadrons were dissolved, aircraft were scrapped or sold as surplus, thousands of trained pilots and ground crews were discharged and forced to find civilian employment. The aviation industry that had finally begun producing combat aircraft in useful numbers suddenly faced cancellation of contracts and collapse of markets. The organizational structures created to support combat operations were torn apart as the military returned to peacetime establishment levels. Much of the expertise painfully acquired during 18 months of combat was lost as experienced personnel left the service and took their knowledge with them. The Army Air Service that remained after demobilization was tiny, poorly funded, flying obsolescent aircraft, struggling to maintain even minimal capability. This boom and bust cycle, rapid build-up followed by equally rapid collapse, would repeat itself in American military aviation after subsequent conflicts, suggesting fundamental problems with how America approached military preparedness in aviation. The memoirs and personal accounts written by American pilots after the war, while varying widely in quality and accuracy, preserved details about the experience of early aviation combat that would otherwise have been lost. These first-person narratives, despite their limitations and biases, captured the fear, excitement, boredom, comradeship and horror of aerial combat in ways that official records could not. They revealed the black humor pilots used to cope with constant danger, the superstitions they developed, the small rituals they performed before missions, the guilt they felt about surviving when friends died. These human details, easily dismissed as irrelevant to military history focused on tactics and technology, actually illuminate essential truths about what sustained men through combat, about why some broke under stress while others endured, about how military organizations maintain cohesion and effectiveness when facing terrible casualties. The final assessment of American aviation in World War I must acknowledge both genuine achievements and significant limitations. American pilots proved they could fight effectively. American ground crews showed they could maintain complex equipment under difficult conditions. American commanders demonstrated they could organize and lead aviation units in combat. But America never achieved aviation independence or self-sufficiency during the war, remained dependent on Allied aircraft and engines throughout, never developed air doctrine distinctly American rather than borrowed from European experience. The organizational and industrial base for effective military aviation was established during the war, but American aviation remained in many ways a junior partner to European air forces throughout the conflict. Only in subsequent decades would American aviation develop the technological, industrial, and doctrinal foundation to become the dominant air power it would prove to be in World War II and beyond. The human legacy of America's first airmen lives on not just in the history books and museums, but in the continued existence of the squadrons they founded, the traditions they established, the standards they set. Units like the 94th and 95th Fighter Squadrons trace their lineage directly to the pursuit squadrons of World War I, maintaining customs and esprit de corps that originated on muddy French airfields over a century ago. The values these first airmen embodied, courage in the face of danger, skill applied to complex technical challenges, determination to accomplish the mission despite obstacles, innovation when established methods proved inadequate, these values remain central to American military aviation culture. Every American military pilot who wears wings is, in some sense, heir to the legacy of Norman Prince, Eddie Rickenbacker, Frank Luke, and the thousands of other Americans who first took to the skies in combat. The story of America's first airmen ultimately transcends the specific details of individual combats or technical achievements to illustrate something fundamental about Americans at war. These were men who volunteered for the most dangerous duty available, who learned new and complex skills quickly, who adapted to alien circumstances far from home, who persevered through terrible losses, who maintained effectiveness despite inadequate equipment and support, and who returned home when the fighting ended to resume civilian lives. Their experience in creating American military aviation from nothing, proving American capability in this new domain of warfare, establishing traditions and standards that would endure, represents an achievement that deserves recognition not just for what it accomplished in immediate military terms, but for what it demonstrated about American capacity for innovation, determination, and courage when facing unprecedented challenges. The men who flew with courage in those early days, whether they survived to tell their stories or died in French skies far from home, earned their place in American military history, and their legacy continues to inspire new generations of American airmen, facing different challenges in different skies, but sustained by the same fundamental values of duty, courage, and excellence that defined America's first military aviators.